The dossier they gave me on the shuttle ride up was 47 pages long. I read it twice. By the end of the second pass, I set it face down on my knee and looked out the viewport at the neutral world turning slowly below us, and I thought, we have been at this for 17 years? 17 years of interstellar diplomacy, 17 years of summits, accords, framework agreements, supplementary framework agreements, and emergency sessions convened to renegotiate the terms of the supplementary framework agreements. 17 years of the finest diplomatic minds in 6 civilizations flying to this assembly chamber, filing into their seats, and spending the better part of each session making absolutely certain that one individual, left the room feeling that she had won. Name, transliterated into something my tongue could manage, came out roughly as Vanesshi matriarch Solen Vahar. Every delegate called her the matriarch. Some called her, in private, other things entirely. The dossier called her the Vanesshi Accord's primary stakeholder and paramount signatory authority, which was the diplomatic equivalent of calling a black hole a gravitational inconvenience. She was the reason the Accord existed. She was also, in 17 consecutive years, the reason the Accord had never actually been signed. My name is Marco Vidal. I had been a diplomatic attaché for 11 years before this posting, and I had never once been the primary representative for anything. I was the man who prepared briefings, checked translation matrices, made sure the catering met cultural dietary requirements, and sat quietly in the third row taking notes, while people more important than me said important things to other people more important than me, all of whom were more important than me in ways that had previously seemed permanent. My supervisor, a woman named Reyes, had been the primary representative for the Theron Summit cycle before this one. She had lasted 9 days before requesting emergency medical leave. The diagnosis, as I understood it from the official documentation, was exhaustion. The actual cause, as I understood it from the look on her face when she handed me her clearance badge in the departure corridor, was something that doesn't have a clean medical name. It was the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent 9 days trying to read a map that keeps redrawing itself. Don't let her get under your skin, Reyes had said. Who? I had said, because at that point I genuinely hadn't finished the dossier. She had stared at me for a moment, with the expression of a person who does not have the strength to explain fundament, and is calculating whether the person in front of them will figure it out on their own before it's too late. Then she had said, read the dossier, all of it, and walked away without another word. And I had watched her go down the corridor and thought I had never seen Reyes walk away from anything in 11 years, and that this was probably significant. I read the dossier, all of it both times through. The Vanesshi were a matrilineal civilization. That much was public knowledge, had been since first contact, was in every general briefing document and cultural orientation packet that Earth's diplomatic corps produced. The dossier made clear, with the careful, bloodless language of people who had been writing careful, bloodless language for nearly 2 decades, and had gotten very good at embedding alarming things in neutral phrasing, was that the Vanesshi diplomatic tradition was built on a principle that could be summarized, if one were being undiplomatic about it, as follows. The person who needs the agreement less holds all the power, and the way to need it less than your counterpart is to make your counterpart perpetually uncertain about whether you actually want one at all. The matriarch had taken this principle and refined it over 17 years of practice on a captive audience into something that approached an art form, not a comfortable art form, the kind that makes you feel something you don't entirely want to feel, because what it illuminates is accurate. She had, over 17 years, walked out of 7 sessions. She had declared 3 of those walkouts to be final, irreparable breaks in relations, permanent withdrawals of the Vanesshi delegation from the Theron process, and had returned each time without explanation, without apology, simply resuming her seat at the next scheduled session, and beginning proceedings as though the previous session had ended on cordial terms. The other delegations had learned, after the first return, and then after the second, to greet these reappearances with careful neutrality, neither acknowledging the walkout nor pretending it hadn't happened, occupying a diplomatic middle ground that required a particular kind of practiced amnesia. She had, on 4 separate occasions, agreed to language in a draft accord, firmed that agreement through the vanesshi, ceremonial ratification gesture, which involved pressing one's primary tactile membrane to the document, while a witness from the opposing delegation observed. And then, for 48 hours of that ceremony, announced that the agreement was invalid, because the atmospheric pressure in the chamber had been 3 microbars lower the vanesshi cultural minimum for binding commitments. This requirement had not appeared in any vanesshi position paper, memorandum, cultural briefing document, or prior communication of any kind. It emerged, each time fully formed, in the invalidation notice. The Theron Secretariat had, at significant expense, installed a precision atmospheric regulation system after the 3rd such declaration. The invoice for this was not in the main body of the dossier. It was in the appendix, which either an act of mercy toward the reader, or an acknowledgement that the number was better encountered at a point when one had already committed to reading further. Found it and looked at it for a long moment. It was by any reasonable human standard an obscene figure. By the standard of what it had apparently not accomplished, it was worse. The matriarch had then declared the 4th agreement invalid, because the regulation system's operational hum fell within a frequency range the vanesshi considered spiritually dissonant during binding ceremonies, a range, I noted, that she had not mentioned when approving the installation of the regulation system 9 months earlier. The Secretariat had replaced the regulation system. The replacement invoice was also in the appendix, beneath the first one. I did not calculate the combined total, because I didn't think it would improve my mood. There were 23 pages of the dossier dedicated to what the summary called protocol sensitivities. This was the document's careful way of saying, here are the things you must not do, say, imply, suggest through tone, suggest through posture, suggest through the timing of your contributions, communicate through the spatial arrangement of objects on the table in front of you, because each of them has, at some documented point in 17 years of proceedings, triggered a response from the vanesshi delegation that set the negotiations back by a period ranging from 3 weeks to 4 months. The list was comprehensive. It included expressing agreement with another delegate's point before the matriarch had expressed her own view on it. It included expressing disagreement with another delegate's point after the matriarch had already expressed agreement with that point. It included asking the matriarch a direct question without first allowing a period of what the dossier called reflective space, which was calibrated at between 8 and 14 and depending on the topic's emotional register, a calibration I was apparently expected to develop a sense for through practice. It included, and this was the one I read twice, slowly, appearing to be in too good a mood at the start of a session. This, the dossier explained, had been interpreted on 2 separate occasions as evidence that the human delegation had received positive news that they were deliberately withholding from the matriarch, which she had characterized, in formal diplomatic communication, as a betrayal of the collaborative trust that the Assembly's relationship with the vanesshi delegation was founded upon. I set the dossier face down on my knee and looked at the neutral world turning below us for a while. We'd been doing this for 17 years. 17 years, and an atmospheric regulation system, and its replacement, and 23 pages of things not to do, and 7 walkouts and 4 invalidated agreements, and 9 years of framework language that hadn't made it to a signed document. 17 years of some of the finest diplomatic professionals that 6 civilizations had produced, spending their working hours learning the choreography of not upsetting one person. I finished my coffee. I picked the dossier back up. I read it a 3rd time. The Theron Assembly Chamber was large enough to hold 600 delegates in tiered seating that curved in a 3/4 arc around the central floor. The ceiling was glass, a dome of panels fitted together with joints so precise you could only see the seams if you knew where to look and held your angle exactly right. And through the glass you could see the neutral planet below, and in the far arc of the chamber's orbital position, the attendant fleets that each delegation had parked in formal holding formation as a matter of diplomatic protocol. 6 fleets, 6 configurations, 6 species ideas of how much firepower was appropriate to bring to a peace negotiation, and park visibly in the sky above it. The vanesshi fleet was the largest. It had been the largest at every session since the first. That, like the atmospheric requirements and the protocol sensitivities, was also not an accident. The chamber smelled of filtered air and the faint ozone trace of holographic display systems cycling in idle mode. And there was something underneath that smell. Some combination of 6 different species ambient biochemistries and the ventilation system's best efforts to blend them into something neutral that I eventually learned to simply not notice. The way you stop noticing the sound of your own building's heating system after the first week. I came in through the human delegation's entrance, which was on the lower left of the arc, and was met at the door by Andres, my assistant. Andres had been at the Theron Assembly for 3 of its 17 years. He was 29 years old and had the specific look of someone who had seen enough to have strong opinions, but had not yet accumulated enough rank to express them freely. He handed me a cup of something hot and looked at me the way junior staff look at a superior they are privately calculating survival odds for. Trip? He said. Informative, I said. Walk me through the room. He did. The Theron Secretariat's official was in the elevated position at the arc's midpoint. A small composed Theron, whose name was difficult, and who went by a designation I will render as Orvith. The Dreen delegation was already seated, their 4 armed forms arranged with the studied stillness of people who had learned that sudden movement attracted the wrong kind of attention in this room. Keth delegation was arriving in careful formation, their lead diplomat walking at a pace I recognized from the dossier as Keth formal mode. Unhurried, deliberate, communicating no urgency, inviting no interpretation. The Orathi observers were in the upper tier, their compound optical clusters giving them the full 360 field that let them watch the matriarch section, and the Dreen simultaneously, without appearing to look at either. Found the Orathi the most comfortable beings in any room I had shared with them, because they made no secret of watching everything, and simply did it with the unconcerned efficiency of a species for whom information gathering was as natural as breathing. The vanesshi delegation came to the floor in a column of 12, moving through the vanesshi entrance with the unhurried precision of a procession that had been practiced. The matriarch was 6th in the column. The mathematical center I had read, which was deliberate placement in vanesshi ceremonial tradition. She was tall by the standards of her species, with the characteristic vanesshi elongation of the upper torso and a cranial structure that swept back in a smooth ridge above the brow line, tapering to a narrow point. Coloration was deep violet gray, the kind that darkens with age in vanesshi physiology and is considered in their culture a marker of accumulated authority. And her robes were the pale, silver white of senior vanesshi diplomatic rank, layered in the formal count of 7 that the briefing documents noted indicated a delegation of the highest standing. She moved without visible hurry, looking at nothing in particular, and sat at the vanesshi position, at the central floor's main table with the composure of someone who had been in this chamber so many times that it had become simply another room she occupied. She arranged her documents with precise movements. She accepted a cup from one of her attendants and did not drink from it immediately. She did not look at the human delegation section. I had read enough of the dossier to know that this was not an accident either. The session opened with Orvan's formal 12 words that conveyed, with the economy of someone who had given them many times, that all parties were valued and that the Secretariat hoped today would move things forward. There was something I genuinely admired in that compression. The welcome was followed by the Dren broker's opening remarks, 2 minutes 40 seconds of careful optimism about mutual benefit and shared goals that said nothing specific enough to be wrong. Then the human delegation's opening remarks. I had prepared 2 minutes and 20 seconds. I walked to the speaker's position, looked at the assembled delegates, and said what I had prepared. Earth's commitment to the Accord. Earth's respect for all parties. Earth's hope that this session would bring us closer to a signed agreement that served the interests of all 6 civilizations in this chamber. I timed it internally, 2:22. I returned to the human section and sat down. The matriarch watched me walk back to my seat. It was the first time she had looked at the human section directly. Expression registered nothing that I could read, which the dossier had warned me was her default operating mode, and should not be interpreted as either positive or negative until context accumulated. When it was her turn to speak, she stood, arranged her robes with two small, precise movements, and addressed the chamber for 19 minutes. I want to be careful about how I describe what she said, because I am not going to caricature it. The substance was real. There were genuine vanesshi security concerns embedded in the proposed accord, legitimate questions about enforcement mechanisms that hadn't been fully resolved, reasonable positions on resource allocation that deserved thorough discussion. None of that was performance. The performance was in the architecture, built around the substance. The pauses that stretched 2 beats longer than the rhythm of the argument required. The way her gaze would move to a delegation, just after she said something that a less charitable listener might read as criticism of their previous position. Holding there for a count of 2 before moving on. 3 references, embedded in the body of her remarks, to previous sessions in which other delegates had shown, in her characterization, insufficient consideration for vanesshi cultural requirements. These references were not accusations, not precisely. They were more like pressure applied to the room, a reminder of the history, of who had walked out and returned, and what had been given to secure that return, placed in the air where everyone present could feel the weight of it. The drain broker shifted slightly in his seat at the 3rd reference. The Keth delegation leader stopped writing for a moment. The Orathi observers observed. She sat down at 19 minutes and 14 seconds. Orvith made no comment about the overage. I wrote in my notes, she sets the ceiling. Everyone else calibrates to her. Then I wrote below that. Why does she need them to? The afternoon session addressed Article 7, the enforcement mechanism for restricted zone navigation. Paper, a straightforward article. The basic language had been agreed upon, according to the records, twice before. Both times it had been unwound within a week, each time for reasons that appeared in the unwinding notice, but hadn't been raised during the agreement. The drain broker presented the current draft. The Keth raised 3 procedural questions. Raised one question of clarification about the verification timeline. The Orathi offered a technical note on zone boundary definitions that was genuinely useful. Everything proceeded with the careful efficiency of people who know. From experience that progress, when it happens here, is fragile, and should be handled like something that might shatter. Then the matriarch spoke. She had a concern, she said, about the implied frequency of verification cycles in the draft language. The current text specified verification at intervals of no less than 1 standard year, the vanesshi position, and she was presenting this as an expression of sincere cultural consideration, not as a demand. She was careful to clarify, and she hoped the assembly would receive it in the spirit of honest dialogue in which it was intended. Was that annual verification cycles implied a level of distrust fundamentally incompatible with the collaborative relationship the accord was designed to formalize. The vanesshi people, she said, had a long cultural tradition of agreements built on mutual recognition rather than surveillance protocols, and the current draft asked the vanesshi signatory to accept a framework that her people would experience as adversarial at its foundation. Regardless of how it was described in the preamble, the chamber held the specific quality of silence that it produces when everyone present is doing the same calculation simultaneously and waiting to see who speaks first. The drain broker cleared his throat. He said he understood the matriarch's concern and that the drain were open to discussing alternative language that might better reflect the collaborative spirit the accord was designed to express. He glanced at me as he said it. The Keth delegation leader glanced at me. The observers did not glance at me, but they had full 360 field, and I was under no illusion that I was outside it. I looked at my copy of the draft text. Then I looked at the matriarch. Matriarch, I said. The annual verification cycle appears in the current draft because it was proposed by the vanesshi delegation in Session 14, accepted by all parties in Session 15, included in the agreed language that was ceremonially endorsed by the full assembly in Session 16, and has appeared in every subsequent draft version without objection for the past 3 years. 7 drafts over 3 years. The chamber was very quiet. The matriarch looked at me. Her expression did not change. It was the expression of someone who has registered an unexpected variable and is determining its weight before deciding what to do with it. The human delegation, she said, after a pause, I counted at 4 seconds, appears to have a different recollection of the session history than the vanesshi delegation. I have the session records here, I said. If it would help to review them, I'm happy to do that. A pause. 3 seconds this time. That will not be necessary, she said. The vanesshi delegation remains committed to finding language that all parties can support. She said nothing more about the verification cycle for the remainder of the session. Andres was beside me in the corridor at the break, wearing the expression of a person watching someone walk across ice and running calculations he isn't sharing aloud. I let him run them. Make sure the session records are accessible for the full delegation, I said. All sessions, the complete archive. All 17 years. All 17 years. He nodded slowly, then went to do it. The crisis came on day 3, and in retrospect, I should have anticipated it. The dossier had documented the pattern clearly enough. The walkouts tended to follow sessions, in which the matriarch had been, in some way she chose not to specify afterward, unsatisfied with the tenor of proceedings. Day 3 of a new lead delegate's first summit was, based on the historical record, when she typically took full measure of what she was working with. It began with the seating arrangement. The Theron Secretariat configured the floor for each session based on a rotation schedule that had been publicly documented and in operation since the second year of negotiations. On day 3, the matriarch's delegation arrived to find that the rotation had placed the Keth delegation in the position immediately to the vanesshi right, which was, the matriarch informed Orvith, incompatible with the vanesshi spatial dignity protocols that she had communicated to the Secretariat in a memorandum submitted 4 years and 2 months earlier. I pulled up the memorandum during the 40-minute delay, while Orvith and her staff worked to reconfigure the floor. The memorandum existed. It specified that the vanesshi delegation should not be seated adjacent to any delegation with which the vanesshi were currently in a state of formal diplomatic review. The vanesshi and the Keth had concluded their formal diplomatic review 14 months ago, with a mutual statement of normalized relations that both delegations had signed, and that was in the public record. The Secretariat noted this politely and precisely. The matriarch acknowledged that the formal review had concluded, but indicated that the cultural sensitivities which the memorandum was intended to address did not automatically resolve with the conclusion of a formal process. The residual considerations were real and ongoing. She was prepared to be flexible, she said. She simply needed the Secretariat to understand that her delegation's ability to engage productively was directly connected to the conditions of the space they occupied, and she hoped that was something the Secretariat could respect. The floor was reconfigured. It took an hour and 23 minutes total. Orvith managed the process with the expressionless efficiency of someone who had done this before. When we finally convened, the matriarch offered no acknowledgement of the delay and proceeded directly into a presentation on Vaneshi's historical grievances regarding restricted zone enforcement. A presentation that covered, as I checked against my records, material that had been presented in sessions 3, 7, 11, and 15, with variations in phrasing that were small enough that I could track the evolution of specific word choices across the 4 iterations. It was not a new argument. It was a familiar argument being delivered by a person who understood that repetition, in this room, had a function distinct from the transmission of new information. I let her finish. The presentation ran 31 minutes. Then I said, Matriarch, the points you've raised here were addressed in the response framework the Drain brokered in session 15. The conclusions of that framework are in the record. Would it be useful to review them in this session? The human delegation, she said, and there was a quality to it that I could not quite name. Something between formal acknowledgement and something cooler, is eager to reference past sessions. The record is useful, I said. I'd rather build on what's already been established than revisit it from scratch. The vanesshi delegation finds, she said, that the past is often invoked selectively. Then I'd be glad to review it comprehensively, I said. We have the time if you'd like. She looked at me for 3 seconds. Then she said, the vanesshi delegation will need a brief recess. She stood. Her 12 delegates stood. They filed out through the vanesshi exit without looking back. The drain broker turned to me very slowly and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, they typically return within 90 minutes in situations of this kind. I'll be here, I said. They returned in 83 minutes. The matriarch resumed her seat, arranged her robes, and said without any indication that she had left. The vanesshi delegation is prepared to continue, I said. Good. Shall we start with the Session 15 framework? We started with the Session 15 framework. By the end of the first week, I had a clearer map of what the previous 17 years had actually been. It was not, or not only, a diplomatic negotiation in the technical sense. It was a sustained management exercise centered on a single relationship. And the reason the accord had never been signed was not because the underlying issues were genuinely intractable. They were not. They were the ordinary complicated issues of multiple civilizations trying to share space and resources, and had been substantially resolved in concept by Session 9 of the process. But because the process itself had become for the matriarch a thing that served a purpose separate from the purpose it was nominally designed to serve. I want to be careful about this, because I have no interest in being reductive. The matriarch was, by any technical measure, an exceptional diplomat. She had complete command of the history of every negotiation. She understood each party's actual interests, as distinct from their stated positions. A distinction that most delegates never fully master. She could read the internal state of a room from the small signal that most people don't know they're sending. And she could act on that reading with a speed and precision that I found genuinely impressive, even when what she was acting on was an opportunity to destabilize something that had been moving toward resolution. The issue was not her competence. The issue was what she had built around it. A system in which the assemblies need to keep her engaged, to keep her from walking out permanently and taking the vanesshi fleet home, gave her a leverage she had extended, session by session over 17 years, into near total control of the process's rhythm and direction. Every concession made to her became the new floor from which the next request was measured. Every accommodation the Secretariat granted, the atmospheric system, its replacement, the reconfigured seating, the extended speaking times, the protocol sensitivities that filled 23 pages of my briefing document, became institutional precedent she could invoke the next time the room needed to hold still while she repositioned. And because no one wanted to be the delegation that drove her out, because the vanesshi fleet was substantial, and vanesshi commercial relationships underpinned a significant portion of the neutral zone economy, and the consequences of a permanent breakdown were not imaginary. Everyone accommodated. Everyone recalibrated. Everyone learned, session by session, the specific choreography of a room, organized around keeping one person from leaving it. She had trained an entire assembly. That is not a small thing to observe. It requires patience and consistency and a willingness to play a long game that most people don't have the temperament to sustain. In a different context, with different aims, it would have been a remarkable achievement. The question I sat with, in my quarters on the 7th night, reviewing my session notes and looking at the records going back to year 1, was what to do about it. Not about her, I want to be precise here, but about the dynamic, the pattern, the 17 years of learned behavior, that the entire assembly had settled into like a groove worn into stone. So familiar that no one thought to ask whether the groove was going in the right direction. The dossier's implicit answer was, nothing. You manage it. You accommodate where you must. You hold where you can. You keep the sessions running and the vanesshi delegation at the table. And you add your own pages to the institutional record so that whoever comes after you has a slightly more refined set of adjustments to calibrate to. That answer had produced 17 years of process without an accord. I thought about Reyes, walking away down that corridor without enough energy left to explain. Thought about the 23 pages. I thought about the atmospheric system and its replacement, and the number in the appendix. Then I thought about what I actually knew about the matriarch from the records, stripped of the institutional framing, just as a portrait of a person doing a thing for a very long time. And I thought about the question that the records, paradoxically, didn't answer despite containing 17 years of her words and actions. What did she actually want from the Accord? Not from the technical questions of navigation rights and resource allocation. From the walking out and the returning, from the invalidated agreements and the reconfigured floors, from the 19-minute speeches and the precisely timed pauses. What did she want from this specific dynamic, this particular arrangement in which an entire assembly shaped itself around her, that the Accord itself wouldn't give her once it was signed? I sat with that question until it stopped feeling like a diplomatic problem and started feeling like a simpler one. Day 9. The session was Article 11, Resource Allocation in Neutral Zones. This article had been the subject of 5 previous dedicated sessions and had reached near final language twice, before being retracted on grounds that shifted slightly each time. I had reviewed all 5 sessions. The actual sticking point was consistent across all of them. Not the substance of the allocation formula, which was reasonable, and which the vanesshi negotiators had themselves helped develop, but the phrasing of the section describing the vanesshi contribution to the shared maintenance framework. The matriarch had in each of the 5 sessions found the phrasing insufficient to convey the full significance of what the vanesshi were committing to. Different words, same concern. I had spent 2 evenings working on new language with Andres and our cultural analysis officer. The new phrasing was good. I believed it genuinely addressed the concern rather than papering over it. I presented it in the morning session. The matriarch listened with the full attention she brought to things she was actually evaluating, which was a different quality than the attention she gave to things she had already decided about. She asked 3 questions. I answered them directly. She asked a follow-up to the second, which I also answered. Then she said the vanesshi delegation would need time to consider the proposal and would respond in the afternoon session. Reasonable. I said so. We moved to other business. In the Mastrun says that the vanesshi delegation had given the human proposal careful consideration and found it to be a thoughtful effort, reflecting genuine engagement with the vanesshi position. However, it had become clear to the delegation, in the course of their consideration, that Article 11 could not be productively addressed until the Assembly had returned to Article 3 and resolved a matter of foundational principle that the vanesshi delegation had raised in Session 8, and that had not, in their view, received satisfactory resolution. Article 3 was the preamble. The preamble's language had been finalized by consensus in Session 12. It had been in the agreed draft, in exactly its current form for 5 years. The drain broker made a careful note. The Keth delegation leader's stylus paused above his tablet. I looked at my copy of the draft accord, and then at the matriarch. Matriarch, I said. What specifically in Article 3 remains unsettled from the vanesshi perspective? The characterization of the Accord's purpose, she said. The current preamble frames the Accord as a multilateral framework. The vanesshi position is that this characterization fails to adequately reflect the Accord's essential nature, which is a formal relationship of mutual recognition between civilizations of equivalent standing and historical significance. The current preamble language was proposed by the vanesshi delegation in Session 6, I said. The specific phrase multilateral framework was introduced by your delegation's secondary attaché and accepted by the Assembly in Session 7. A pause. The vanesshi delegation's understanding of the Accord's purpose has developed over the course of these negotiations. Has it developed specifically since yesterday afternoon? I said, when we confirmed the morning session would be dedicated to Article 11. The chamber produced the specific quality of silence that it saves for moments when something is said that everyone in the room recognizes as different in kind from ordinary diplomatic exchange. The matriarch looked at me with an expression I had not seen in 9 days of watching her face. It was not anger. I want to be careful about that, because anger would have been simpler. It was something more precise. The look of a person who has been doing a particular thing for a very long time. and has just encountered someone who can see exactly what the thing is, and is describing it without apparent malice. Recognition. Mixed with something that might have been wariness. Or might have been something else I didn't have the right word for yet. The human delegate, she said, with the careful spacing that indicated she was choosing words rather than reaching for prepared ones, appears to have strong views about the session agenda. I do, I said. I also have views about the 17 years this assembly has spent approaching an agreement that is genuinely good for everyone in this room, including the Vanesshi people, and not reaching it. Article 11 deserves the afternoon. A pause. Longer this time. The Vanesshi delegation does not appreciate being managed, she said. I'm not managing you, I said. I'm telling you what I think. Those are different things. What I think is that you are capable of signing this accord today, if you decided to. And I believe you know that, as well as I do. The pause that followed was the longest I had experienced in that chamber. I counted 7 seconds. The drain broker had gone completely still. The Keth delegation leader had put down his stylus. Even the Orathi observers in the upper tier had a quality of heightened attention, which for beings with passive 360 field was saying something. The human delegate, the matriarch said finally, with a cadence I could not precisely categorize, is very direct. I've been told that, I said. I apologize if it's discourteous. That's not what I intend. What do you intend it as? The question had weight behind it. Not hostility. Something more genuine than that. I took it seriously. Respect, I said. You have been the most capable person in this chamber for 17 years. I'd rather speak to you honestly than spend my time calibrating to what you might need to hear. That seems like a waste of what you're actually capable of engaging with. 4 seconds. We will address Article 11, the matriarch said. We addressed Article 11. What followed in that session was not dramatic by the standards of how people imagine diplomacy. No speeches. No declarations. The matriarch, her 12 delegates, the drain broker, the Keth, the Orathi observers, myself, Andres, and the rest of the respective staffs sat in that glass-domed chamber and worked through the language of an article that had been almost settled for 9 years, and we settled it. She asked questions, I answered them. She proposed modifications. Some I accepted, some I didn't, and on 3 occasions I said, with the session records open on the shared display, that the modification she was proposing was substantively identical to language the Vanesshi delegation had already agreed to move away from in an earlier session, and she did not contest this. She offered smaller modifications. We found language that worked for everyone in the room. By the close of the afternoon session, we had Article 11, signed off, in the agreed draft. Done. I would not say the matriarch seemed pleased. She was not the kind of person whose pleasure surfaced in ways that were easy to read. And I was not, at this point, reading her for approval the way previous delegations had apparently learned to do. But there was a quality to the way she gathered her documents at the close of session that was different from the previous 8 days. A quality of having done something solid, something that would still be there tomorrow, rather than having performed something that would require maintenance. I noticed it and did not remark on it. Andres appeared at my elbow with coffee and the expression of someone who has just watched an experiment produce an unexpected result and is deciding whether to be pleased or alarmed about it. 11 sessions left in the scheduled summit window, he said after a moment. 12 articles still open, I said. We'll need to move. He nodded slowly. Then do you think she'll walk out again? I considered it honestly. I think she might, I said. I think if she does, she'll come back faster. Why? Because the records are open, I said. Not as a threat, I'm not using them as leverage. But knowing the full history is present in the room changes what the room is. It's harder to revise what's documented when everyone has access to the documentation. Andres looked at me for a moment. Is that diplomacy? I genuinely don't know, I said. Ask me when we have a signed document. She walked out once more. Day 13, over a phrasing dispute in Article 17, that was, on the technical merits, a legitimate concern. The original draft used a term that had a secondary implication in formal Vanesshi usage that none of us had caught, and she was right to flag it. And the appropriate channel was a session note or a direct communication to the drafting committee rather than standing up and leading her delegation out through the vanesshi exit. But I had enough of a read on the rhythm by then to understand what the walkout was actually about. Not Article 17. It was a question delivered in the language she had used for 17 years. Will you come after me? I did not come after her. I sent Andres to inform the vanesshi delegation's secondary attaché, a careful, precise individual named something I rendered as Korath, that the human delegation looked forward to the matriarch's return and that we would hold Article 17 for her review when she was ready to return. For message. No drain intermediary, dispatched with soothing language. No emergency recess of the full assembly. No rearrangement of the schedule to demonstrate that we were taking the walkout seriously as a crisis. We moved to Article 18. We worked through it. We made progress. She was back in 4 hours and 11 minutes. The fastest return in the historical record. As Andres later confirmed from the archive, she sat down, arranged her materials with the 2 precise movements and said, "Shall we return to 17? "Whenever you're ready," I said. The phrasing concern in Article 17 was real, and we resolved it. Corrected language was genuinely better than the original. Cleaner, more precise, less susceptible to the misreading she had identified. Told her so. She accepted that without visible response, but she noted the correction in the record with a degree of specificity that indicated she was paying attention to whether acknowledgement meant something here or was another form of management. It meant something. I meant it. Day 19. And I want to tell you about it carefully because it was when I understood what the previous 17 years had actually cost, beyond the atmospheric systems and the protocol appendices and the sessions that went nowhere. 2. We were in Article 22, the final article, the sunset clause for certain navigation restrictions. A genuine technical complexity, one of the last real ones. The kind of problem that requires people who actually understand what they're negotiating to be in the room and willing to stay in it. Teen Broker had been working on bridging language for 3 hours. He was good. He had been here for 11 of the 17 years, and he knew the material as well as anyone. The language he produced was right. You could see it when he presented it. The correct balance, the accurate reflection of what each party actually needed from this clause. The matriarch read it. She read it a second time, slowly. She set it down on the table in front of her. And then she did something I had not seen in 19 days. Fraction of a second. Small, gone almost as it appeared, replaced immediately by the composed working expression I had learned to read as her default mode. She looked uncertain, not about the language. About what came after the language, she said. The vanesshi delegation needs to consider this overnight. Reasonable request. The last article. I said. Of course. After the session, in the human delegation's working room, André sat down across from me and was quiet for a moment in the way he had learned, over 20 days, to be quiet when he was building towards something. Then he said, "She's afraid." "Yes," I said. "Of signing." "Of what comes after signing," I said. I looked at my copy of the draft. 22 articles. 17 years of sessions behind them. And she has been the center of this process for longer than some of the junior staff in this building have been working. Process ends when the accord is signed. She becomes a signatory instead of the primary stakeholder. A different relationship to the room. Andres was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's sad," I said. "Yes." He sat with it. "Does it change what you do?" he asked. "No," I said. "The accord is good for her people. That doesn't change. Because she's afraid of what comes after. Understanding why someone is afraid of a necessary thing doesn't mean you help them avoid it. It means you don't make it harder than it has to be." I paused. It changes how you talk to them about it. It changes what you're actually trying to do in the room. You're not trying to win, trying to make it possible for her to do the thing she knows is right. Andres nodded slowly. "Do you think she knows it's right?" "I think she's known it was right for a long time," I said. "That's not the same as knowing how to do it." Day 20, the final session of the scheduled summit window. The matriarch arrived at the same time as always, in the same column of 12, in the 6th position. She arranged her documents. She accepted her cup and did not drink from it immediately. She did not look at the human delegation section. The drain broker presented the bridging language for Article 22 in its final form. The Keth delegation leader confirmed their acceptance. The Orathi observers noted approval on behalf of the observing parties. I confirmed the human delegation's acceptance. The chamber waited. The matriarch looked at the language on the table in front of her. She looked at it for a time that I did not count because counting felt wrong in that moment. The chamber had the quality of a held breath. Not the tense, held breath of a room waiting for a confrontation, but something more like the quality of a room full of beings who are watching something that has been a long time coming and have the decency not to speak while it arrives. Then she looked at me, not at the chamber, not at the assembled delegations, at me directly with the full focus of her attention, which was, when she chose to direct it without the filtering layers of diplomatic performance, a genuinely remarkable thing to be on the receiving end of. Clear and precise and containing something I couldn't fully name, measurement perhaps, or recognition of some kind. You have been, she said, an unusual delegate. I'll take that as a compliment, I said. It was intended as an observation, she said. The human delegation has not behaved during this summit as previous delegations have behaved. No, I agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, why? I thought about the honest answer. I owed her the honest one. Because I think you deserved better than what previous delegations gave you, I said. What they gave you was an audience, and they kept giving it because they were afraid not to. I think you're more than someone who needs an audience. I think you always were. The pause this time was different from all the others. Not the calculated pause of someone choosing when to apply pressure or when to withdraw. Just a pause. A person sitting with something said to them. The Vanesshi delegation, she said, accepts the language of Article 22. The chamber exhaled. Diplomatically, quietly, with the trained composure of 6 civilizations worth of professional restraint. But it exhaled. The collective release of something that had been held at tension for a very long time, finally being set down. Orvith called for the formal ratification procedure with the efficient composure of someone who had waited 11 years to do so. The accord was produced in its ceremonial form. Each delegation confirmed acceptance in the appropriate protocol for their species. When the vanesshi delegation's turn came, the matriarch stood, arranged her robes with 2 precise movements, and pressed her primary tactile membrane to the document. She held it there for a moment longer than the protocol required. Then she removed her hand. The impression remained in the ceremonial material, a clear record of contact, of presence, of a decision made and kept. The accord was signed. She gathered her materials, rose from her seat, led her column of 12 out through the vanesshi exit with the same unhurried precision with which she had entered on day 1. She did not look at me again. The door closed behind the last of her delegates, and the chamber held the silence that follows things that have been a long time coming. The formal reception was that evening. I stayed for 40 minutes. Said what needed to be said to who needed to hear it, and left. Andres found me at the viewport in the human delegation's quarters, looking down at the neutral world turning slowly below. Green broker wants to speak with you, he said. I'll find him tomorrow. He came and stood beside me and looked at the planet without speaking for a while. Then, she messaged the secretariat. I looked at him, the matriarch, about an hour after the session closed. A formal diplomatic commendation for the conduct of the human delegation during the summit. He paused. Orvith says it's a formal vanesshi instrument, carries specific cultural weight. Shh. She said it's not something they issue commonly. I looked back at the planet below. Through the viewport, I could see the fleets beginning to break their holding formation, 6 groupings of ships angling away from each other, along their respective departure vectors. The vanesshi ships were the most elegant I had ever seen from the outside. Long, smooth-hulled, built for a kind of speed that left very little noise in its wake. Make sure it goes into the full session record, I said. Already done, he said. We stood there for a while longer, watching the ships disperse into the dark. The dream broker had told me at the reception that it was the fastest summit conclusion in the Assembly's history. He said it with a kind of awed bewilderment. The expression of someone whose model of how long things take had just been revised without warning. I didn't tell him what I thought, which was that it wasn't fast. 17 years is not fast. Days at the end of 17 years is just the moment the accounting came due, and someone was in the room who was willing to hold the books open and let the numbers speak for themselves. The Vanesshi lead ship fired its main drive somewhere on the far side of the planet's shadow and began its long arc away, and I watched the drive signature until it blended with the stars, until it was just another point of light among all the others, moving somewhere, going somewhere, not gone. That was enough. I will tell you about the conversation I had with Korath on day 16, because it belongs in any honest account of what happened, even if it never appeared in the official record. Korath was the Vanesshi delegation's secondary attaché. In the political architecture of a Vanesshi diplomatic mission, that title carried more weight than the word secondary could convey accurately in translation. She was not subordinate to the matriarch in the ordinary chain of command sense. She was the person responsible for the delegation's institutional continuity, for ensuring that the knowledge base and standing commitments of any given summit survived changes in the matriarchal line, for maintaining the delegation's internal coherence across the long cycles of Vanesshi political succession. She was, in practical terms, the person who held the memory. She approached me at the end of day 16's closing session, in the corridor outside the chamber's main floor exit, while the other delegations dispersed, and the ambient noise was sufficient that a quiet exchange between two individuals would not be easily overheard by anyone making a deliberate effort. The correct form of address for my rank in Vanesshi diplomatic protocol was attaché. She used it. I used hers in return. We stood in the corridor in the manner of two people having a conversation that was not entirely formal and was not entirely informal, and that both of us knew was neither of those things precisely. She said, "The delegation has noted the human delegation's approach to this summit. I hope it has been useful," I said. "Unusual," she said. She paused in a way that felt like actual thought rather than a deliberate instrument. "The matriarch has not previously had a counterpart in this chamber who engaged with the full session history as you have." "I found it instructive," I said. 17 years of records is a substantial document." "It is," she said. "Most delegates work from the summary." A brief pause. "The summary is curated." "I noticed," I said. "Curates it." She looked at me for a moment with the compound consideration of someone deciding how much honesty the situation warranted, measuring the distance between what was appropriate to say and what was true. "The Secretariat produces it in consultation with all delegations," she said. "That is the standard process." "Including the Vanesshi delegation," I said. "Including all delegations," she said, and the repetition was its own answer. The corridor had thinned to near empty around us. I said, "Korath, can I ask you something directly?" "You may." "Is the accord good for the Vanesshi people?" The pause that followed was long enough that I had time to register its particular quality. Not tactical. Not a calculation of what answer best served the delegation's negotiating position. Pause of a person who has been waiting a long time for a question to arrive in precisely the right form. "Yes," she said. "It is good for the Vanesshi people. The technical terms serve our interests. The resource allocation is fair. The navigation framework protects what needs to be protected. The accord is good." "Then what is she afraid of?" I said. Korath looked at me for 4 full seconds. Then she said, "She has led this delegation for 23 years. She was appointed to this process in its 3rd year. In 20 years of summits across 4 assembly chambers, she has never worked with a counterpart who treated her as someone capable of simply making a decision and keeping it." She adjusted the fall of her robe with one small, precise movement. "That is all I have to say on this subject," she said, and walked back toward the Vanesshi wing without another word or a backward look. I stood in the corridor for a while after she left. I thought about what 20 years of being managed felt like from the inside. Not managed with cruelty. Not managed with contempt. The managing that happens when people decide, without meaning any particular unkindness by it, that you are a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be dealt with honestly. That the appropriate response to you is perpetual calibration. That the primary work of any room you enter is the work of keeping you satisfied enough not to leave. That your stability is the goal, rather than your agency. That you are too complicated, too volatile, too significant to simply be told the truth and trusted to do something with it. 20 years of that. And she had built the entire architecture of her diplomacy around the central fact of it, using the only tools the Assembly had ever given her to work with: leverage, ambiguity, the strategic withdrawal, the returned expectation. She had become, in that process, exactly what the Assembly had trained her to be. That is also a cost. It doesn't appear in any appendix. I went back to my quarters and sat with it for a long time. There is one last thing worth saying, though it is the smallest detail in this account, and may be the most important. On the morning of day 20, before the final session, I arrived at the chamber early, as I had done on most days, to review the session agenda and confirm the records were accessible, and to allow myself a few minutes of quiet before the day's protocol began. The chamber was empty, except for Orvith's staff running final configuration checks on the floor displays. The glass dome overhead caught the light of the neutral planet below and scattered it in long, pale angles across the curved seating tiers, and the chamber in that early stillness had a quality very different from its quality in session, when 6 civilizations' worth of accumulated history filled it. The vanesshi delegation arrived before their scheduled time, slightly unusual. They were, as a rule, precise. The matriarch was 6th in the column. They moved to their table with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times. The delegates took their positions, and then, before she sat down, before the document arrangement and the accepted cup, and the composed expression settling into the working mode I had learned over 20 days to read, the matriarch paused. She looked at the chamber as a whole, not at any delegation section, not at the floor displays cycling up, not at the dome above where the neutral planet turned slowly in the daylight sky outside, and the fleet formations held their positions. Just the room. The room where something had been happening for a very long time, and where something different was about to happen today. And she was here for both of those things simultaneously. It lasted 2 seconds. Then she sat down and arranged her documents with 2 small, precise movements and accepted her cup from her attendant. I looked back at my notes. I did not mention it to Andres. Not that evening, at the reception. Not in any of the briefing documents I filed afterward. Not in any conversation I had about the summit. There are things that belong to the record, and things that belong to the room, and the difference between those 2 categories is not always about importance. Some things you carry and do not make official and know perfectly well were real. The session opened. We did the work. The accord was signed. We all went home.